Whispers in the gallery. Nora Petrov carefully adjusted the small placard beside the Degas sculpture, ensuring it sat perfectly level.
Ow.
The Metropolitan Museum of Art buzzed with the quiet energy of a Tuesday morning, scholars in corners whispering over notebooks, tourists with audio guides pressed to their ears, and the occasional school group moving like a colorful caterpillar through the grand halls. "Excuse me, is the alignment correct now?" Nora asked, her voice carrying the melodic lilt of her native St. Petersburg. She glanced up at her supervisor, Margaret Whitman, who peered critically at the display.
Rice better.
Margaret replied with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not sure why this is taking so long. The other placards were finished an hour ago." Nora nodded, swallowing the explanation about the special mounting requirements for this particular display. She'd been at the Met for only 3 weeks as a visiting curator brought in specifically for her expertise in 19th century European sculpture. The Metropolitan Museum had offered her a 6-month position that could become permanent, a dream opportunity that had pulled her away from her comfortable position at the Hermitage Museum. "I'll finish the remaining displays immediately," Nora said, straightening her blazer as she walked away. She caught the whispered exchange between Margaret and Thomas, the senior curator. Brilliant eye for detail, but that accent. Can you imagine her leading the donor tours? Hartwell will never approve her for a permanent position if she can't communicate clearly. That's such a shame. The word stung, but Nora had grown accustomed to such judgments. At 32, she had built an impressive academic career despite the constant undercurrent of assumptions that followed her voice wherever she went. Her doctoral thesis on the evolution of sculptural techniques had been published in 3 prestigious journals, yet people still spoke to her slowly, as though her accent indicated a lack of comprehension rather than simply marking her as someone who had mastered a second language. Later that afternoon, while cataloging recent acquisitions in the basement storage area, Nora found unexpected company. Julian Alvarez, the museum's new director of international partnerships, was examining a crated painting that had arrived from Madrid. Double quotes, Dr. Petrov, he said with a warm smile. Just the expert I was hoping to find. Julian was tall with thoughtful brown eyes and a quiet confidence that Nora had noticed during their brief interactions at staff meetings. His reputation preceded him, brilliant negotiator, fluent in multiple languages, and responsible for some of the museum's most successful international exhibitions. "How can I help?" Nora asked, consciously trying to soften the sharp consonants of her English. "This Goya has some provenance questions I thought you might help clarify given your background in European art history." He gestured to the paperwork. "That is, if you have a moment." For the next hour, they've bent over documents and discussed the painting's journey through various collections. Julian listened intently as Nora explained the historical context, never once showing impatience with her occasional search for the right English word. "Your analysis is exceptional," he said when they finished. "We're fortunate to have your expertise." Nora felt her cheeks warm slightly at the genuine compliment. "Thank you. This is fascinating work. Some colleagues and I are having dinner tonight at Catalonia to discuss the upcoming international gala. Would you join us? Your perspective would be valuable." The invitation surprised her. The International Gala was the museum's most prestigious annual event, bringing together donors, artists, and museum directors from around the world. Being included in its planning would be a significant professional opportunity, she replied, trying to contain her excitement. As Julian left, Nora remained in the quiet storage room, surrounded by art treasures from across centuries and continents. Perhaps here, among these objects that transcended language and borders, she might finally find a place where her voice, accent, and all could truly be heard. The invitation, the warm glow of Catalonia's amber lights, cast Julian Alvarez's face in soft shadows as he gestured animatedly. Describing his vision for the Metropolitan Museum's International Gala, Nora watched him with quiet admiration occasionally, glancing at the other dinner companions, Vanessa Chen, the museum's marketing director, and Dominic Okafor, the head curator of contemporary art. "The theme is bridges between worlds," Julian explained, his Spanish accent lending a musical quality to his words. "We'll showcase how art transcends cultural boundaries, Perfect timing with our new Eastern European exhibition, Dominic commented, turning to Nora. Your expertise will be invaluable, Dr. Petrov. Nora nodded, carefully composing her response before speaking. The exhibition highlights how artistic movements flowed across borders despite political divisions. Perhaps we could create a special tour for gala attendees. She noticed Vanessa's slight wince at her pronunciation of political and felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the constant awareness of how her accent affected others' perception of her competence. Exactly what I was thinking, Julian said, his eyes meeting Nora's with unexpected warmth. Do you consider leading that tour yourself? The board members and major donors would benefit from your insights. Vanessa cleared her throat. Julian. Perhaps Dr. Wong from Asian Art would be better suited? His communication style is more accessible to our American donors? The implication hung in the air. Nora stared at her paella, suddenly finding the arrangement of saffron rice fascinating. I believe Dr. Petrov's unique perspective is precisely what makes her the ideal choice, Julian replied firmly. Her understanding of cultural nuance is unmatched. The evening continued with planning discussions, but Julian's defense lingered in Nora's mind. Later, as they walked through the chilly Manhattan evening toward the subway, Julian fell into step beside her. I hope Vanessa's comments didn't bother you, he said quietly. I'm used to it, Nora replied, watching her breath form small clouds in the November air. People hear my accent before they hear my words. Julian stopped walking, turning to face her, their loss. I find your perspective refreshing both professionally and personally. Something in his expression made Nora's pulse quicken. Over the next few weeks, their professional collaboration evolved into coffee discussions about art history, then dinners where they debated restoration ethics and museum accessibility. Julian's respect for her intellect was matched only by his fascination with her journey from St. Petersburg to New York. One evening, after they had visited a small gallery in Chelsea, Julian confessed, My mother was a professor who fled Franco's Spain. She never lost her accent, and American academics never let her forget she was an outsider. His eyes held Nora's. Watching you navigate this world reminds me of her strength. Does it get easier? Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, he said honestly. But you find people who hear you, not just your accent. Their first kiss came naturally that night, on her doorstep under the glow of streetlights. For the first time since coming to America, Nora felt truly seen. Yet as their relationship deepened, so did the challenges at the museum. Margaret continued, assigning Nora to behind-the-scenes work, away from donors and visitors. When Julian insisted that Nora present her research at a board meeting, the room's reaction was painfully familiar, polite smiles. Masking impatience as they struggled to focus through her accent, board member Eleanor Huntington approached afterwards, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she placed a manicured hand on Nora's arm. Such fascinating research, dear. Perhaps you could write it up for our newsletter instead. Some concepts are lost in translation. That evening, Julian invited Nora to dinner at his apartment, where she was surprised to meet his visiting sister, Lucia, and her husband, Francisco. The siblings shared the same warm eyes and quick laugh, but where Julian had embraced Nora without reservation. Lucia's assessment was coolly evaluating. Julian tells me you're quite the academic star, Lucia said over dinner, her perfect English carrying the subtle polish of expensive schools. Though I imagine the museum world must be challenging for someone still mastering English, Lucia, Julian warned. What, I'm being supportive, Lucia replied with an innocent smile. Communication is essential in cultural institutions. Remember how Mother struggled? Francisco joined in. The gala is in 3 weeks, Julian. Will Dr. Petrov be giving that tour you mentioned? The Ashcrofts and Vandermeers are attending. They're considering major donations. Nora felt Julian tense beside her. She placed her hand gently on his. I understand their concerns, she said softly. Perhaps we should reconsider my role at the gala later. As they washed dishes together, Julian's frustration boiled over. This is exactly what happens in elite institutions. Brilliant minds are sidelined because they don't fit the expected mold. Nora carefully dried a wineglass. Your sister isn't entirely wrong. The museum needs those donations. and they'd get them if people would just listen to your ideas instead of fixating on your accent. Julian set down a plate with more force than necessary. The gala planning committee wants you involved. I want you there beside me. His phone buzzed with a message. Julian read it and looked up, his expression serious. The museum director wants to finalize the gala program tomorrow, including the speakers and tour guides. He took her hands in his. Nora, I believe in you. But you need to believe in yourself too. That night, alone in her apartment, Nora stared at her reflection and practiced her English pronunciations, wondering if her voice would ever truly belong in the world she had worked so hard to join. Preparations and doubts. The Metropolitan Museum's conference room buzzed with tension as Director Harrison Hartwell reviewed the International Gala program. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the glossy presentation folders before each committee member. Nora sat straight-backed beside Julian, acutely aware of Margaret Whitman's disapproving glances from across the table. For the Eastern European exhibition tour, Harrison continued, glancing over his reading glasses. Julian suggests Dr. Petrov lead our platinum donors through the new installation. The silence that followed felt leaden. Margaret cleared her throat. With all due respect to Dr. Petrov's credentials, I'm concerned about clarity of communication. These are our highest-level donors, precisely why they deserve our foremost expert, Julian countered smoothly. Dr. Petrov's doctoral work on cross-cultural influences in European art is unparalleled. Harrison's gaze settled on Nora. Dr. Petrov, do you feel prepared for this responsibility? These donors expect a certain polish. Implication was clear. Nora felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her expression composed. I believe my knowledge of the collection would provide substantial value to the donors. However, I understand the museum's concerns about my accent. It's not just the accent, Margaret interjected. It's about cultural fluency. Our American donors expect a certain conversational style. Julian opened his mouth to object, but Nora continued, I propose a compromise. I can prepare written materials to accompany the tour, ensuring all technical details are clearly communicated. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. A reasonable solution. We'll proceed with Dr. Petrov, leading the tour with supplementary materials. His tone made it clear the discussion was closed, as the meeting adjourned. Nora felt conflicting emotions. Validation mingled with the sting of having her accent treated as a problem to be mitigated. Julian squeezed her hand under the table, a small gesture of solidarity that warmed her despite everything. That evening, Nora worked late in her office, meticulously preparing her tour notes. The phone call from Julian came unexpectedly. My parents are in town, he said, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. They'd like to meet you before the gala. Dinner tomorrow night? The prospect of meeting Julian's parents, especially after Lucia's cool reception, sent anxiety coursing through her. Yet his relationship with his family, particularly his mother, who had faced similar challenges, meant everything to him. I'd love to, she replied, hoping her voice conveyed more confidence than she felt. The following evening, Nora found herself at an elegant Spanish restaurant in Greenwich Village, seated across from Gabriela and Antonio Alvarez. Gabriela's silver-streaked hair framed an intelligent face with Julian's same expressive eyes, while Antonio's distinguished appearance spoke of academic gravitas. Julian tells us you're from St. Petersburg, Gabriela said, her Spanish accent melodious, yet pronounced even. After decades in America, I visited the Hermitage once before the Soviet Union fell. Magnificent. Nora relaxed slightly. It was my academic home for many years. The Met is quite different, but equally inspiring. And how are you finding New York? Antonio asked, his accent thicker than his wife's. It can be an unforgiving city for newcomers. Before she could answer, Lucia and Francisco arrived, their entrance drawing attention from nearby diners. Lucia kissed her parents before turning to Nora with a practiced smile. We were just discussing Dr. Petrov's adjustment to America, Gabriela explained. Oh yes, Lucia said, examining the wine list. The cultural differences must be challenging. especially professionally. Her eyes flickered to Julian. The museum world is so dependent on one's ability to charm donors. Julian tensed. Nora's qualifications speak for themselves. Of course, Francisco agreed with false generosity, though in practice, presentation matters as much as content. The gala is crucial for the museum's funding this year. The conversation circled this theme throughout dinner, veiled comments about Nora's foreignness, thinly disguised concerns about her suitability for Julian and his career. While Julian grew increasingly defensive, Gabriella observed with quiet attention as dessert arrived. Lucia mentioned casually Victoria Hammond. "We'll be at the gala. She's on the board of the National Gallery now. She and Julian were quite close at one point." "Ancient history," Julian said firmly, his hand finding Nora's under the table. Later, as Julian walked Nora home through the crisp autumn night, his frustration spilled over. "I'm sorry about Lucia. She's always been protective, but this is beyond acceptable. She's worried about you," Nora said softly. "About your reputation if the gala tour doesn't go well." "That's not her concern." But what if she's right? The question that had haunted Nora for weeks finally emerged. What if my accent undermines the museum's fundraising? What if I embarrass you? Julian stopped walking, turning to face her under a streetlight. "Nora, you could never embarrass me. Your mind, your perspective, your passion for art, these are what matter. It's not how you pronounce English vowels." His conviction steadied her, but as the gala approached, doubts multiplied. Nora spent hours practicing her tour presentation, recording herself and critiquing every syllable. She researched each donor who would attend her tour, preparing personalized observations about their collections and interests. 3 days before the gala, Nora received an unexpected visitor in her office. Gabriella Alvarez, elegant in a simple navy dress. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the chair opposite Nora's desk. "Of course," Nora replied, surprised. Gabriella studied her for a moment. "My son is quite in love with you." Directness caught Nora off guard. "I care for him deeply as well. When I came to America," Gabriella continued, "I was a respected literature professor in Madrid. Here I became the woman with the accent. Despite my publications and research, some colleagues never saw past how I spoke." She leaned forward. "Do you know what saved me?" Nora shook her head, refusing to apologize for my voice. "My accent tells the story of where I've been and what I've overcome." Gabriella's eyes held Nora's. "The question isn't whether your accent will affect how some people hear you. It will. The question is whether you'll let their limitations define your worth." As Gabriella rose to leave, she added, "Julian said you're preparing extensively. For this tour, remember, expertise alone isn't enough. True confidence comes from embracing all of who you are." The words stayed with Nora as she continued her preparations, wondering if she could find the courage to fully claim her voice. Accent and all, before the most important professional night of her American career. The evening of Truth, the Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed against the November night sky, its grand facade illuminated for the International Gala, limousines lined Fifth Avenue as attendees in formal attire ascended the broad stone steps. Inside, the great hall had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors. While floral arrangements towered beside classical sculptures, Nora stood in a staff preparation room, smoothing the midnight blue gown she had carefully selected for the evening. Her reflection showed a woman poised and professional, though only she could feel the flutter of nerves beneath her composed exterior. "You look stunning," Julian said from the doorway, handsome in his tuxedo. "Ready for your moment?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Nora replied, tucking a final pin into her upswept hair. The event began with cocktails and orchestral music, donors and dignitaries mingling beneath the soaring ceilings. Nora moved through the crowd beside Julian, acutely aware of curious glances as he introduced her to board members and patrons. Director Hartwell nodded approvingly at her knowledgeable responses to questions about the new exhibition, though. She noticed how some listeners leaned forward with furrowed brows as she spoke. "Dr. Petroff, Julian." The voice belonged to Eleanor Huntington, approaching with a silver-haired man and a younger couple. "I'd like you to meet William Ashcroft and his son and daughter-in-law, Thomas and Penelope. They're considering a significant contribution to the European collections. Nora recognized the name immediately. The Ashcrofts were among the museum's most important potential donors. William Ashcroft's piercing blue eyes assessed her as Julian made introductions. Dr. Petrov will be leading your private tours later, Eleanor explained. She's visiting from Russia, St. Petersburg, Nora corrected gently. Though I've been in New York nearly a year now. Fascinating, William replied with practiced politeness. And how are you finding American museums compared to Russian institutions? As Nora began to answer, describing the different curatorial approaches, she watched William's attention drift, his eyes scanning the room as though looking for someone more important. Beside him, Penelope whispered something to Thomas, who suppressed a smile. "Excuse me," William interrupted. "I see the Japanese ambassador has arrived. We should say hello, Eleanor." As they walked away, Nora overheard Penelope's whispered comment. "God, that accent. I caught maybe every third word." The sting of the dismissal lingered as dinner was announced. Seated at a table with museum patrons and visiting curators, Nora participated in conversations about art markets and exhibition trends, though she noticed how some guests directed their questions to others after brief exchanges with her. Across the room, she spotted Lucia and Francisco at a table with Victoria Hammond, the woman Lucia had mentioned as Julian's former relationship. Victoria was striking with perfect posture and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to influence. Throughout dinner, Nora noticed her leaning toward Julian at the head table, laughing at his comments with practiced charm. After dessert, Director Hartwell approached the podium for announcements and acknowledgments. Tonight's program includes exclusive tours of our newest installations. Our Eastern European exhibition tours will be led by visiting curator Dr. Nora Petrov, whose scholarship was instrumental in bringing these works together. A polite smattering of applause followed. Nora saw Margaret Whitman lean toward Eleanor Huntington, whispering something that made Eleanor's eyebrows raise in concern. Nearby, Lucia cast a worried glance at Julian. As guests moved toward the exhibition spaces, Nora took a moment alone in a quiet corridor, drawing deep breaths. The weight of the evening, the sidelong glances, the whispered comments, the subtle dismissals threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "There you are." Gabrielle Alvarez appeared beside her, elegant in burgundy velvet. "A moment of quiet before your tour." Nora nodded, unable to fully disguise her apprehension. "You know," Gabriella said thoughtfully, "when I gave my first lecture in English at Columbia, a student complained to the department head about my accent." She smoothed her sleeve. "I spent weeks afterward practicing American pronunciation, trying to erase my Spanish cadence." "Did it help?" Nora asked. "It made me a poorer teacher," Gabriella replied. "I was so focused on how I sounded that I lost the passion in what I was saying." Her eyes met Nora's. In the end, the students who bothered to listen found value. The others missed out. Before Nora could respond, Julian appeared with William Ashcroft and several board members. "Everyone's assembled for the tour," he said, his eyes conveying encouragement. The exhibition gallery held about 20 people, the museum's most significant donors and several international art patrons. Nora recognized the Japanese ambassador, the Vandermeers and Victoria Hammond standing near Julian. Lucia and Francisco had positioned themselves at the back. Watching with undisguised concern, Director Hartwell made brief introductions, then gestured for Nora to begin. As she stepped forward, saw Margaret Whitman hand out the supplementary materials they had prepared, a tacit acknowledgement of their lack of confidence in her ability to communicate clearly. "Good evening," Nora began, her voice steady, despite the nervous tension in her chest. "Tonight, I'll guide you through crossroads of expression. Our exhibition exploring artistic dialogues between Eastern and Western Europe during the Cold War era." As she began explaining the first installation, Nora noticed the familiar signs: furrowed brows, exchanged glances, one patron leaning toward another to whisper. William Ashcroft checked his watch while Penelope studied the printed materials. Rather than looking at the art Nora was discussing, am I correct that this Kandinsky was created during his time in Germany, not Russia? Victoria Hammond interrupted, her tone suggesting she was correcting rather than inquiring. Actually, Nora replied, this particular work dates from his Moscow period. After he returned from Germany during World War I, the German influence remains visible, but the spiritual elements reflect his Russian Orthodox background. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As the tour progressed, Nora felt the energy in the room shifting. Some patrons genuinely engaged with the artwork, while others maintained a polite but distant interest. When she overheard Thomas Ashcroft mutter, "Can barely understand a word," to his wife, something inside Nora finally broke. Gabriella's words echoed in her mind, refusing to apologize for my voice. Years of accommodation, of careful pronunciation, of minimizing her presence, suddenly seemed an unbearable compromise. This exhibition represented her life's work. These artworks told stories that transcended national boundaries, and she had earned her place in this room. Standing before Malevich's Super Mattis composition, Nora made a decision. She set aside her prepared notes and looked directly at the assembled guests. "Art speaks in a language beyond words," she said, her accent no longer carefully modulated. "Perhaps that is why it bridges divides when diplomacy fails." Then, to everyone's surprise, she continued in fluid, perfect French, "Ces œuvres représentent un dialogue entre des mondes séparés par des idéologies, mais unis par une, quote, artistic commune." Without pausing, she shifted to impeccable Spanish. "Durante la Guerra Fría, da. Cuando los palabras falaban. Entre los gobiernos. Los artistas continúa ben su conversación. Silenciosa, atrás los fronteras." Several guests straightened in surprise. Julian's eyes widened, a smile beginning to form. Nora continued, now in Italian, "Questi artisti ci ricordano che la bellezza trascende la divisione politica." Then German, "Die Kunst spricht, direkt zur Seele, unabhängig von nationalen Grenzen." And finally, returning to her native Russian. The gallery had fallen completely silent. Even those who had been disengaged now stared in astonishment. Nora concluded in English, her natural accent embraced rather than disguised as you move through this exhibition. "I invite you to hear the conversation between these artists across borders and decades. Each fought to preserve human expression. During a time when individualism was dangerous, their courage reminds us that art is humanity's shared language." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Japanese ambassador began to applaud, followed quickly by others. Gabriella's eyes shone with pride, while Julian beamed. Even Director Hartwell looked impressed. "Remarkable presentation," William Ashcroft commented, approaching Nora. "You're fluent in all those languages?" Actually, Nora replied with newfound confidence. Art history requires understanding cultural contexts in their original languages. As the tour concluded, guests crowded around Nora with questions, genuine curiosity replacing polite disinterest. Victoria Hammond kept her distance, while Lucia's expression had transformed from worry to grudging respect. Later, as Nora and Julian shared a quiet moment in a deserted gallery, he said, "You never told me about the languages. You never asked," she replied simply. "You were too busy listening to what I was saying rather than how I was saying it." He took her hand. "That was the most extraordinary tour in Med history." "Perhaps," Nora said, "but more importantly, it was the first time I've spoken here in my true voice." Beyond words, morning light streamed through the tall windows of Director Hartwell's office as he leaned back in his leather chair, regarding Nora with newfound respect. 1 week had passed since the International Gala, and the ripples of that evening continued to spread throughout the museum. "The Ashcrofts have confirmed their donation," Hartwell announced, sliding a folder across his polished desk. $7 million for the European collections, with specific funding for Eastern European acquisitions and scholarship. He cleared his throat. "William Ashcroft mentioned your tour as the deciding factor." Nora accepted the folder, still processing the news. "I'm grateful the exhibition resonated with them." "It wasn't just the exhibition," Hartwell said, his usual brusqueness softened by admiration. "Thomas Ashcroft specifically mentioned your multilingual presentation. Apparently Penelope studied linguistics at Yale, and was thoroughly impressed. He adjusted his glasses. "You've made quite an impression, Dr. Petrov." Outside Hartwell's office, Margaret Whitman waited with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Dr. Petrov, might we speak in my office?" The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had before. Margaret, usually dismissive, spoke candidly about the museum's culture. "I misjudged you," she admitted, fingers nervously arranging papers on her desk. "Perhaps I was protecting my own position, or perhaps I've internalized certain biases about accents and capability." Her eyes met Nora's. "The Japanese ambassador has requested you personally guide their cultural delegation next month, and the Vandermeers want you to consult on their private collection." As Nora left Margaret's office, she found Julian waiting in the sculpture gallery, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "Have you heard?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "About the Ashcroft donation?" "Yes, Director Hartwell just told me." "It's not just that," Julian replied, leading her toward the European Paintings wing. "The International Council of Museums has invited you to present at their spring symposium in Paris, and the board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your permanent appointment." Nora stopped walking, overwhelmed by the cascade of developments. A month ago, she had been hidden away in storage rooms, her expertise acknowledged, but her voice considered a liability. Now that same voice, accent and all, had opened doors she had feared permanently closed. "It's happening rather quickly," she said, the familiar caution resurfacing. Julian's expression grew serious. "You earned this long ago, Nora. The world is simply catching up to what I already knew." That evening they celebrated at a small restaurant in the West Village, joined by Gabriella and Antonio. The conversation flowed effortlessly between English, Spanish, and Russian, each language carrying different facets of their shared stories. "When I was first teaching at Columbia," Gabriella reminisced, "a colleague suggested I take accent reduction classes." She laughed softly. "I told him I'd consider it if he learned Spanish first." "What changed?" Nora asked. "How did you make peace with being forever marked as foreign?" Gabriella considered the question. "I realized my accent wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but evidence of a journey many never brave enough to make." Her eyes, so like Julian's, held Nora's gaze. "The question isn't whether others accept your voice, it's whether you do." 3 months later, Nora stood before a packed auditorium at the International Council of Museums. Symposium in Paris. Scholars and museum directors from around the world had gathered to hear her. Presentation on cross-cultural curation and accessibility. "Museums exist between worlds," she began, her accent now a natural part of her professional identity rather than an obstacle to overcome. "Between past and present, between nations, between languages. Our challenge is not to erase these boundaries, but to transform them into bridges." In the front row, Julian watched with pride as the woman he loved commanded the attention of the world's foremost cultural leaders. Beside him sat William Ashcroft, who had flown in specifically for her presentation, and Director Hartwell, whose initial skepticism had evolved into staunch advocacy for Nora's permanent appointment as Senior Curator of European Art. Most surprisingly, Lucia and Francisco had also made the trip, their relationship with Nora transformed since the gala. Lucia had approached her the morning after the event, offering a genuine apology for her assumptions. "I thought I was protecting my brother," she had admitted. "Instead, I nearly drove him away from someone who truly understands him." As Nora concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, she reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The mockery and dismissal had been painful, yet they had ultimately pushed her toward a more authentic expression of herself, one that embraced rather than apologized for her multinational identity. Later, at a reception overlooking the Seine, Nora found herself in conversation with the director of the Hermitage Museum, her former mentor from St. Petersburg. "We'd like you to consider a joint appointment," he proposed. 6 months at the Met, 6 months with us. Building connections between the institutions. The offer represented everything Nora had once dreamed of: recognition of her expertise, validation of her unique perspective, and the opportunity to bridge the cultural worlds that had shaped her. "I'll need to discuss it with the Met," she replied, "and with Julian." As if summoned by her thoughts, Julian appeared beside her, easily joining their Russian conversation. After her mentor departed, Julian led Nora onto the terrace, the Eiffel Tower glittering against the night sky. "I overheard the Hermitage offer," he said. "It's an extraordinary opportunity. It would mean dividing my time between New York and St. Petersburg." Nora replied, studying his expression. Julian took her hands in his. "I've been meaning to improve my Russian anyway." His eyes held hers. "Wherever you go, Nora, I want to be there, learning your languages, sharing your worlds." Under the Paris stars, Nora reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that moment in the gala when she had finally embraced her true voice. The journey had taught her that authentic communication transcended perfect pronunciation. It resided in the courage to speak one's truth, accent and all. "You know," she said softly to Julian, "they say you can never truly understand a culture until you love someone from it." "Then I'm well on my way to becoming fluent in yours," he replied, drawing her close as the city of lights sparkled around them, a fitting backdrop for two people who had found, beyond words, the universal language of understanding.